Okay, the need for profiles. Well, I think we all know we need profiles, but normally when I do a presentation about fire, I tell everyone, you know, if you take the specification, we have written a specification that you can just pick up and write and you can make software with it. Well, that's in some ways it's true, but it's also not true, because most of the resources we've made are defined in a very generic way. They can be used in all kinds of contexts. So you'll see that if you look at the definitions, hardly any field is required. Lots of things are optional. And that's logical because you use the same resources in a document and in a message and maybe on the REST interface when you're developing your web application. Which means that sometimes people ask me and say, look, I looked at patient and I see that the patient's organization is allowed to be null. How can that be? How can you have a patient that's not part of a hospital? Well, if you send a message you want to send a message with just a patient ID, it would make sense to also include the organization because that's within the organization. So you'll see that's all optional. And the only way to make such a common resources actually more useful in a specific context is to use profiles, to constrain these enormous freedom to things that are applicable for the context that you want to use them in. That means that you're going to write a profile if you're defining a message. You're going to write a message profile that says exactly I'm going to use these resources in the message and I'm going to constrain them like this and this. So you're going to restrict them based on context. And the good thing is that those profiles aren't text. Those aren't free text. Profiles are actually a computable thing. A bit of data that computers can read and validate instances of messages, documents, and resources against those profiles. So, what can you do with a profile? I have a patient here. So now you're already lucky you sit a little bit on the front. There's a lot of things here, but what you can do is that, for example, you can demand that the identifier that's here 0 to star be restricted to 1 and use your national patient identifier number. You can see here patient has 0 to star names. It might well be that you say, well, I don't want that. I want just 1. You can do that. Marital status here. We made up, or we reused rather, from the existing V3 and V2 value sets, marital status. But marital status is certainly something that's very sensitive to context and culture. So I'm pretty sure that you want to change the codes in that value set for marital status to make it fit your context. You can do that. And finally, a lot of people have asked about it. Where is race code? Where is ethnicity? Well, we didn't add that because for many countries outside the US, it's not really a normal thing to collect those things and keep them in your patient administration. So they aren't there. So what we did do is provide extensions already in the base standard to add that to patient. But that would be a prime example of an extension that you can make to patients. So generally speaking, there's all kinds of ways to constrain an existing resource and you can extend it. So when I said that a profile is not just a document, but it's a structured thing, I actually meant that profile itself is a resource. And that's something to get used to, is that just like a patient and a medication prescription, a profile is a resource. And that means that any fire server can store and reproduce profiles as well as it could store and reproduce patient data. And it also means that a client writing a bit of software to fetch patient data could, with the same code, with the same knowledge of that developer, fetch a profile somewhere and use that profile. There's nothing new involved in the FHIR standard to use profiles, which is a good idea, I think. And that also means that any FHIR server actually is a profile repository. So it also means that profiles are referred to by a URL. We still hope that in the near future you will be able to go to this actual address, and when you go there, it will return you a FHIR resource, a FHIR profile resource, which contains everything you need to know about the things we didn't put in FHIR, but those are in ISO 21090. So if we put these profiles up somewhere in the cloud or on the server, how do we actually use them? Well, when we are communicating resources between servers, we can tag a resource. We can put a kind of a memo on them and saying, I'm here declaring, I am as a client sending you this resource, that this resource conforms to profile such and such. That's just a promise. You know, you don't have to believe the client on his blue eyes, but the client is saying, I'm conforming to this profile. The other way around, servers may state in their conformance profile. Conformance, every server has conformance in which it says, you know, what part of the FHIR specification did I implement? And it can say, I can only accept resources if they conform to this and this profile. And there is also any FHIR server, or at least any rather complete FHIR server, can validate, can explicitly be asked to validate a resource against a profile. So a profile is not just a paper thing. It's also not a bit of XSD schemas or whatever. It's a resource, and any FHIR server implementing the validation operations can validate an instance of a resource against that profile. So here is what I was saying. If you have a patient resource, there's all kinds of tags. FHIR has a tag system that can be used for anything. It can be used to tag and say, listen, this is a test record, forget about it. You know, you can tag it, you can tag it with security tags. But one of those tags is the profile tag. So that will say, this patient actually is not just a patient like any patient. It conforms to the US core profile. And as it says here, that's just a claim. I mean, you'll have to check, you can't believe anyone. What this also enables, and that's, you know, that's when you put these things on servers in the cloud, is that you can do distributed validation. So say I have a mobile app using FHIR, and that wants to store a resource on the server. Here it does. And that resource says, actually, I conform to profile X and Y. And this server here, that's the app's own server, he knows profile X and does the validation, but he doesn't know about profile Y. So what does that thing do? Well, he can just look at the address of that profile and go to another server, maybe that's the country validation server, and say, I don't have this profile. I can do two things. I can actually fetch that profile and validate it myself, but I could also go to the public endpoint of such a country validation server and say, can you validate this for me against that profile? So you can build distributed networks of validation servers validating the profiles that they know about. So it's perfectly possible to have regional or national validation servers that don't even store patient data, but do nothing but the one operation, the validate operation, and validate for everyone who needs that. And of course, if the client wants to do so, he could just go around and let it validate there. So there's all kinds of scenarios you can do here with profiles, as long as you publish them publicly on a repository somewhere. Now, who publishes? Since every profile, since every server can validate, that also means, you know, any server is a profile endpoint, because anyone can publish a profile on a server, start making instances of resources and saying, this resource, you know, it conforms to my profile. Certainly, of course, we will define at HL7 international level, and we have some core profiles and some core extensions that everyone can use. But we totally expect business partners just communicating with the two of them or three of them to create their own profiles. We use maybe the core profiles, well, add all their local stuff and publish that on their servers. And that will grow and grow, and you know, they don't need to be necessarily consistent. And then in the meantime, it may also be that, you know, in the Netherlands here we say, well, what we need is a Dutch version of patient. So we publish that as well, and that might still be compatible with international profiles. And if we do a good job here, probably all the vendors will say, okay, we're going to use that bit as well. That's going from up to down, but it's also perfectly possible that if someone else, a company here, a software company, maybe a specialized some company with their competitors, they define a set of resources for a very specific goal, that you can say, well, what they defined there, that deserves to be elevated to a national level, because they did some very interesting things there. So profiles can also go bottom up and grow from a local piece of information to a national profile. So I really see that this will happen both ways. So what's in a profile? You must imagine that a profile is actually a packaging mechanism. So it's like a zip file. And in the profile there is some metadata, of course, because it's a package, so it has metadata like who's the author of this profile, what's the version, what's the publication status, when was this published, and so on. All the metadata is there once in this package. And then when you have that, you can add to that package sets of constraints, as I showed you, and sets of extensions. And these constraints, on their turn, might point to value sets that are stored yet somewhere else on the server, or they're packaged maybe with the constraints in the profile package. See, some of the constraints may say, in our context, we need you to use this and this and this value set. And value set is yet again another resource. It's a technical resource like a profile. And it can also be stored somewhere on the server. I show you more about that. So both resources and extensions, they point to value sets. And as I told you, then you have the part like resources and extensions that actually point to the profile saying, I'm conforming to this profile. So there are three types of things in the fhir standard that can actually use profiles. One is conformance, so that is saying, a server is saying, everything I do conforms to this profile. All the resources conform to this profile. Every resource can state, I do conform to this profile. And finally, when you actually make a resource, when you make an instance of a resource and you put the data in, you can add extensions there who again point to the extension somewhere on the internet saying, I'm an extension, and here's my definition, and that's also in the